Okay, so let me just introduce you to the audience, if that's okay. I'm filming this on Zoom for those of you who are on Clubhouse right now. Some people will be watching this on YouTube later. Bill Bowtell is Adjunct Professor at UNSW, a strategic policy advisor with a particular interest in national and international health policy structures and reform. You don't mind me going through all of this, Bill. He trained as a diplomat with postings in Portugal, Papua New Guinea, and Zimbabwe. As senior advisor to the Australian Health Minister, Bill Bowtell played a significant role in the introduction of the Medicare health insurance system in 1984. He was an architect of Australia's successful and well-regarded response to HIV/AIDS. Between 94 and 96, he was senior political advisor to the Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, and maintains a close interest in the potential impact of the HIV epidemic and other communicable diseases on the social, economic, and political development of the Asia-Pacific region. Since 2005, Bill was director of the HIV/AIDS project at the Lowy Institute for International Policy, and since 2009, the executive director of Pacific Friends of the Global Fund, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In these positions, he sought to increase knowledge and awareness of the challenges posed globally and to the Pacific region by the three diseases. He's written and broadcast extensively on these subjects and participated in many international and Australian conferences and seminars, especially in relation to HIV. And I should add that he's been a prominent voice in Australia around the COVID pandemic. So, Bill, let's start with the Delta outbreak. What we're going to do is this. We're going to speak for 20-ish, 25 minutes about various things. I'll try and get the volume up here. And we'll speak about that, and we'll try and open it to questions a little later. So let's start with the Delta outbreak in Australia. How should Australia have handled the pandemic optimally, in your view, and what would have been the exit strategy in this perfect parallel universe?
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's very nice to be here, and I look forward to a good discussion with you and the people who are participating in the forum. Australia was in a unique position, together with New Zealand. At the beginning of last year, when America, Europe, the United Kingdom, just made a complete mess of their response, not comprehending the speed with which they had to move to keep COVID out, the original strain of COVID out, Australia and New Zealand, after a very fierce public debate in about February and March, decided that it was possible and desirable to keep COVID out of their countries. This was not the orthodox opinion of many scientists and doctors and governments in Europe and North America. They thought that it was best to let COVID in and to deal with the consequences. And we've seen what a catastrophic outcome that came in Europe, UK, United States as a result of that, Brazil and other countries. So it was the right thing to do, to keep it out. And having kept it out, and we know that in Australia there was a serious problem in Melbourne, where it took a 15-week or so lockdown to bring down to roughly zero, or 2-0, the outbreak of original COVID then. From about October last year, Australia and New Zealand were free of COVID. COVID had been kept out. It had been reduced to zero. What then ought to have happened but did not, is that the Australian government should have moved very rapidly, like the United Kingdom government did, to its credit, to procure the vaccines that almost miraculously had come from science. Nobody thought such a thing could happen, but within very short months, the vaccines were seen to be viable and available and were being developed. In Australia, they ought to have been procured at the middle last year. Had they done so, then by early 2021, Australia would have had more than sufficient stockpile of vaccines to get on with vaccinating the entire population rapidly, effectively, making sure there was geographical and generational equity, but getting on with it and bringing it up to, let's say, 70-80% of the entire population vaccinated by the middle of the year. We would have done that in a zero COVID environment. How good would that have been? How good was the zero COVID arrangement? But instead, thanks to really the triumph of politics over common sense and certainly over what we knew about COVID Delta, one government, the biggest government in the Australian Federation, New South Wales, decided not to protect the borders, not to protect Sydney Airport, not to upgrade quarantine. The Australian government had been dilatory and slow in getting on with vaccinations. And in mid-June of this year, the Delta strain finally broke through at Sydney Airport. There were then 10 days. The New South Wales government, as a political question, a policy question, decided not to move swiftly and effectively to contain that Delta outbreak, but in fact to let it run in the interests of breaking down the zero COVID consensus in Australia, which it so far has done to a great degree, inflicted a great deal of pain and suffering and death and destruction in New South Wales, all in an unvaccinated state and country, as we were in mid-June. So we've got a Delta outbreak in Sydney of very serious proportions, and we're vaccinating in the middle of it to try to bring ourselves up to the vaccination levels that, with prudent planning, common sense planning, we ought to have been under the COVID Delta arrangements. So it's a very shocking hit at proper public health management. It never needed to have happened. It shouldn't have happened. Nobody was ever arguing in this country that we were going to be zero COVID forever and that somehow it had been eradicated from the face of the earth. That was nonsense. But the point was to do it in the right sequence. Procure the vaccines, get people vaccinated, do it behind secure borders, and then when you've got your cake and eat it too, as it were, you can figure out how to open up prudently and effectively so that people can come and move across borders, but not COVID Delta. That's what we've blown in the last 10 weeks in Australia.
So what would the exit strategy have been in that case?
Well, we would have really upped the vaccination levels, and we would have had all the benefits of the economic activity, the travel, all of those normal things that we had grown used to since October. We would have been able to vaccinate behind safe and secure borders, got to, let's say about September 2021. And then if we've got the right contact tracing, the right surveillance, built the right robust systems that would deal with Delta or whatever comes after as international travel opens up, that's great. I mean, this virus is just a mindless piece of DNA fragment. It's not anything special. It responds to a lot of interventions, not medical interventions, but it responds to a lot of behavioural interventions and organisation that can keep it at no or very low levels indefinitely if you work at it and if you adjust your systems and put the investments into all of those sorts of systems and controls. That's what we're going to have to do anyway. Let's not kid ourselves that there is now going to be any opening up day on which we return to the normal that we all left behind in January or so 2020. That's gone. Things have changed for good. Delta is here. We see other variants coming along. We know that this has enormous ramifications for our people. It certainly does in terms of vaccinations that will go on and on forever with booster shots. But I think broadly we've got to say that we want to do all of this with the lowest possible number of cases, deaths, economic disruption going forward into the indefinite future. There is no libertarian free market way to say it's your choice to be vaccinated. We've done our best as governments do, and let's see what happens. Well, we can see that that's working out so poorly now in states like Florida, in parts of Europe. I wish it were true, but it's as much a fantasy really as a lot of the other, politics that passes for good public health. It's really changed a lot, and we have got to change our systems and everything we do if we're going to cope with the coming months and years, the indefinite future.
Well, you've opened up a few cans of worms in that comment, Bill. Okay.
Cans of worms involved in this.
Indeed, many cans of worms. Bad enough. So, what would be the optimal policy to implement today, given that overseas authorities seem to have given up on herd immunity through vaccination? So, and maybe you don't agree with that, but what's the logical next step for Australia given today's parlous situation?
Well, I'm not an epidemiologist or qualified, and but the people I talk to over many months and years who are very good say, well, the idea of herd immunity has just gone out the door. You might remember a year or so ago there was a lot of talk about just letting it run, protect people in aged care homes, and we would get to this herd immunity and things would be fine. Well, that's as dead as a dodo, really, as far as I can see. So what we've got to do now is we've still got to bring down this caseload one way or the other. Now, what's happening in New South Wales and elsewhere, they're following the playbook of a few months ago, the UK and elsewhere, that somehow thought that if you get to some level of vaccination, things would greatly improve. The caseloads would go down, they'd be sustainably low, that the numbers of people going to hospitals, the deaths would be low in consequence, and that it would somehow level out at something like influenza, that there'd be a certain number of cases or incidents of COVID in the community, and that would stay stable. But that's just not being borne out by the evidence. And why would it be? I mean, we don't have a natural immunity to it. It's a novel virus, means all new. So we're learning about all of this as we go along. The whole world is in the middle of a vast scientific experiment. We're all a big Petri dish to see what happens. And we can see that even with vaccinations, every day, science is learning something new about them. What is the requirement, say if you've had Pfizer, for booster shots 8 or 9 months after the second dose? And I noticed just the other day in Israel that they're talking about 4th doses. Now, they're doing that because they're learning as they go. It was a massive investment to get the vaccines there, but a lot of things that would have been known in normal times about the impact of vaccines were not able to be done. We had to vaccinate. So every day we're going to find new things about the impact of vaccines on caseloads and so on, and we're going to have to adjust every day. In New South Wales, governments are saying once you get to 80% of vaccination for double dose, then lockdowns will be a thing of the past. Well, you can no more take lockdowns or lockouts or restrictions or masks off the table in this than you could tell a surgeon not to use a scalpel. They're going to be part and parcel of the public health response to whatever happens with this virus. A year ago, Delta was almost unknown. And as I say, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think it's a pretty fair bet that in a year's time, we're going to be talking about something other than Delta, because that's the way the virus is going to go. So we have to be ahead of that. And before we get, and even on vaccinations, we are now seeing a whole other area that will be in the province of engineers and ventilation engineers and air conditioning people and systems people dealing with how do you deal with a virus that we know is very contagious and infectious in air. And even a year ago, a lot of people were saying that wasn't so. I can well recall advisors to the Australian government saying Delta was not, COVID was nothing really to be done about airborne transmission, and their whole refusal of many politicians to endorse mask wearings was based on that erroneous assumption. So we're going to be in a different situation in a year's time, but we can see that buildings are going to have to be really rethought from the ground up, possibly almost literally, to deal with the consequences of a virus that is really transmissible within air conditioning and ventilation systems, and the same in hospitals, the same in schools, as apartment buildings, the same in any large enclosed space. There's a lot coming down the track.
The government's heavily relying on the Doherty Report, which almost nobody, as far as I can tell, has read. And including my friends in the media, may I say. So what are your views on the Doherty modelling and its assumptions, and how the government is using it to talk about opening up at 70 or 80%?
Well, first to be said...
Of adults.
First to be said, it is good the Doherty Report is done, right? It's very important in this that all the facts and figures are put out there, and then the assumptions are put into it, and then on the basis of those assumptions that are given to organisations like the Doherty Institute, they come to assessments and models based on those figures. Other institutions in Australia have also done very good modelling. Burnet, Melbourne, Sydney universities. And I think it's been a failure, truthfully, of public health policy in Australia, that we only relied on one institute. We should have relied on a variety, looked at all of the assumptions openly and honestly, and understood what was actually being said. Now, in relation to the Doherty Institute report, there's a lot of cherry picking going on. About as much cherry picking as in a cherry orchard. Plucked out a figure called 70% and said that would be a great figure, 70% double vaccinated, and then we can abandon lockdowns, we can resume international travel, it'll be fine. That's basically the assumption of it. But that's not what the Doherty Institute report modelling says. And if people ought to read it. And other institutes have sounded very substantial, have made very substantial conditions as well. The Doherty Institute says that if we're going to keep down deaths and infections and hospitalisations and therefore disruption, there's got to be excellent contact testing, contact tracing and testing. Of course, as you would expect. But here we are in New South Wales with the best part of 1,400 cases a day now. And what's fallen down? The contact tracing. In other places under pressure, the testing rates have not been as they should. So there are going to have to be public health interventions indefinitely under this living with COVID if we're going to keep caseloads and hospitalisations down. That's all in the Doherty report, and the difference between various assumptions about contact tracing and how good these systems are, and all the other systems have got to be upgraded, the quarantine system, the ventilation questions, all of these other questions are in the assumptions, or in some of the assumptions in the Doherty Institute modelling, but it's not a pretty picture. So people who believe that vaccination rates alone can keep us well protected against Delta and what's coming afterwards are just not really doing anybody a favour. They're just misleading or accentuating the positive, eliminating the negative. And of course, one day things will go wrong and there'll be a great deal of disillusionment on the part of the people. And worse than that, there'll be people who will pay with their lives and their health and their jobs because we hoped for the best but didn't plan for the worst.
For those of you on Clubhouse, where we've got Adjunct Professor Bill Bowtell here, public health expert in Australia, strategic policy advisor, and a couple more questions, and then we'll get to audience Q&A. So in a couple of questions, we'll open up audience questions. I want to take a skeptical view. So the Germans have announced that as of next month, as you know, I haven't been following the news closely recently for reasons of my own calm, but I have noticed that the Germans have said they're not going to provide free testing as of early next month. John Campbell on YouTube was remarking about how they're planning for endemicity and therefore changing their assumptions on herd immunity. They're assuming there is not going to be herd immunity. So I guess my question is, Are vaccine passports needed in a world where we give up on herd immunity? And if so, is it because we want to protect the hospital system?
Well, yes, I think you're right. They've given up on herd immunity, but I can't see a future in Australia, I stand to be corrected elsewhere, that doesn't include vaccine passports. I think that is being said by all the Australian political leaders, that you will have to prove that you are vaccinated to participate or be involved with large numbers of activity domestically. And then internationally, it would seem clear that the international airline carriers are going to insist on proof of vaccination and maybe on rapid testing if there's some dispute about it. And many intermediate ports, at least out of Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong and so on, if they come back online, they're going to insist on vaccine passports as well.
Oh, I mean, more for cafes and restaurants and so forth.
Well, I think so. This goes to another whole question, and lawyers, and there's a huge amount of legal work and legislation that it seems to me has to be done, both in terms of employers and employees. Could employers require employees to be vaccinated if they're in customer-facing positions, like in cafes or in hair salons, not to mention hospitals and aged care facilities and so on? Will that be mandated by governments, and should that be mandated? Secondly, from the point of view of customers going into venues, say into a theatre or some enclosed space, what will their expectations be? Will they expect that all the staff, all the people they come in contact with in that venue were employed by the venue owner or the manager or the hairdresser owner, expect them to be vaccinated? And what will happen to people who are discriminated against because they are not vaccinated? I believe actually everybody has rights. I don't believe for a moment that however people got to the decision not to be vaccinated, that you can just dismiss their rights as citizens and say that they're of no consequence. So these are really important questions, and they have to be argued out democratically and on the basis of facts and figures. So I think vaccine passports are going to be there. We're going to have to deal with it, but we're also going to have to deal really in a very adult and considered way with all of the ramifications of such things becoming part and parcel of our life going forward.
When they do open up, are you going to feel... You're a relatively young man, but personally, you're double vaccinated, presumably. Will you feel comfortable sitting in a theatre anytime soon? What protections are you personally taking?
You got to a good point. I mean, the one thing in my life I love, it's the theatre, live theatre, opera, ballet, all of those things. And I have many friends who have been suffering a great deal, who are performers and producers and directors and all the people in that. So this is a really top of mind question. And the question, it is going to come, because I will be comfortable going into a theatre. I want to go back to the theatre and see my friends and performing. But I think I'm going to want to know that everybody in that theatre is double vaccinated. And I think we come to a very interesting other question in that about children. At the moment, children 12 and above are going to be vaccinated. But we all know that parents like to take kids to the theatre from a young age. So what does that mean if kids under 12 are not vaccinated? And there is a range of people in the theatre who are maybe vaccinated or not vaccinated. We know that Delta makes a beeline for people who are unvaccinated. So you can see the problem. If you've got a very loose and free policy on access to that theatre that would allow people who are unvaccinated into the theatre, then what will a parent do in relation to their unvaccinated children going to that theatre? Now, you can raise the question. It's a really thorny and difficult question, But these are the sorts of questions we're just going to have to face and come to some considered opinion about, as well as the question of duty of care, of owners and operators and liability, if there is an outbreak and so on. All of these things have to now be dealt with urgently, and we've got to start coming up with something beyond the facile view, in my view, that getting to 70% double vaccinated is that's the end of the story. Well, it's just the beginning of it, really.
That's the last couple of questions I've got, and then I've seen Ned's already started bringing, allowing people to raise their hands from the audience. We're here with Adjunct Professor Bill Bowtell, a public health expert in Australia who's been very prominent in the media for anyone who's joined us recently. Last couple of questions. What's the biggest lesson from the HIV epidemic that applies to COVID?
It comes down to one word: trust. In the days of AIDS, we or the government of the day, Australia of the day, handled it very differently. And it came down to building trust. And trust is related to transparency and the science and evidence and facts. When Dr. Blewett, who's the health minister, and his shadow Liberal health minister, Peter Boehm, and all of the politicians of those days got together and tried to figure out how to respond to AIDS, the first decision they made was that, well, we would fund everything that was required, but we would separate out the science and the evidence and the structures that provided that information to the people and to the parliament and to the press from what you would do politically. And this was a critical decision because the science was out there for all to see. It was debated, it was contested. Sounds funny to say it now, but in the first year or so, we didn't know what actually was transmitting AIDS. We had the disease, we could see the problems, we didn't know what it was, and science couldn't tell us. And it took a long time before they came up and said it's a virus. That was how rudimentary things were. But it was all out there in the public domain. What we didn't have was this marketing and political stuff, at least in Australia, where the science and the politics was all intertwined. And a lot of it's kept behind closed doors. It's not open and honestly put out there. And we saw that with COVID, what I said before about the preposterous idea that it couldn't be spread in aerosol. Now, that was in the scientific advice going to the federal government. It wasn't contested or challenged, and it was wrong. Now, very different. We dealt with it very differently then. The scientists put out the information. I know that Dr. Blewett and the government, they found out what that information was when it rattled in over the fax machines in those days. And then we had to deal with it. But it was open. And the policy was all the more stronger because there was an open and honest debate, not done behind closed doors. And I mean, Australia's been one thing, but we saw how wretchedly wrong this went under the previous administration in the United States, where the scientists were suppressed from saying the truth, not just to the people, but to the political class. And that, I've got to say, that was no different in America under the previous administration than it was in the days of AIDS under the Reagan administration. And they got it terribly wrong then. They took what should have been a manageable, serious but manageable problem with HIV, which was never as easily transmitted as COVID's proved to be. We could have contained it. Instead, the politicisation of the response in the United States and elsewhere made that small-ish problem, which could have been contained, into a ghastly 4-decade-long worldwide pandemic that has killed 35 million people and is still, I hate to say in the league tables of these things, but the HIV pandemic has killed more people and created more heartbreak and misery than even the COVID pandemic. So politics, nature creates viruses, it does it all the time, every day, they come and go. But the thing that creates pandemics is lousy politicians making bad political decisions for the sake of politics. That's guaranteed to make a serious situation really bad really quickly.
Yes, I should have had your book ready to plug as well. What's the name of the book, Professor?
I wrote a book the other day, Unmask the Politics of Pandemics, which tried to draw a few similarities or lessons from the HIV days to this. The problem with the HIV experience, I think, in practical terms, was it was 3 and 4 decades ago, and very few people in politics are around now who were around then. I was a young guy then, now I'm very old, and I'm one of the few who's been able to span then and now, as has, to his very great credit, Dr. Fauci. He was a great hero of the AIDS response. He told the truth. He was vilified then for telling the truth about AIDS, but he was right then. And of course, we saw with Dr. Fauci, he was vilified mercilessly for telling the truth about COVID and coronavirus, but is still, thankfully for the world, active in advising President Biden and his administration. But there are very few people really at any level who've spanned that whole 4 decades. And when we lose that institutional memory and the people who are there then and there now, or it's not, their advice is not sought or ignored, we do the terrible thing of just repeating the same mistakes, but only worse. And we've done that in many countries around the world.
I was going to ask you a question about how to counter anti-vax misinformation, but I think we've started to cover that and it'll probably come up. And you've opened up a few topics that there's some people already on stage who want to ask you some probably very hard questions. So Ned, I'll throw it to you. Do you have a question to ask the professor based on what we've talked about? And what are your thoughts? And who do you think should ask the first question?
Yeah, I just have one question before we kick it to other folks. Bill, what do you make of the idea that there actually hasn't been as big a difference in health outcomes for countries that have incompetent leaders versus ones that had relatively competent ones, and that the steps that really would have moved the needle, like travel bans from certain countries, China at the top of the list, were not politically tenable for leaders in most countries?
Well, in due course, all those, the facts and evidence will let us understand what different policy settings produced. All I know was that at the beginning, a novel virus that was unknown to science, that was very contagious, that was extremely deadly, started moving around the world. When that happened, the prudent, sensible thing to do was to stop the movement of the virus, because the virus itself doesn't fly, it doesn't move independently of people. So the logical thing to do, as they did in China and Taiwan and elsewhere, was the moment it got going, was to stop it moving. And once you could do that, you could figure out its lethality, its infectiousness, its properties, because who would know? Nobody could predict that at the time. And the countries that did that, they had a very good initial outcome. They reduced deaths, they reduced cases, they reduced the impact on their economy, and it gave them time to figure out what to do. You buy time. The countries that decided for political reasons that you couldn't shut down travel from here, you could shut down travel from China, but not from somewhere else, or that they made assumptions about the populations. Nobody would ever expect that you could recommend masks or you could impose upon the people to respond to it. All of those countries just fell off a cliff. 130,000 people died in the United Kingdom, 600,000 in the United States. And that's just the direct deaths, not to mention the massive economic and other dislocations that were caused. So I think it's a prudent public health question. We should have, the countries that stopped it moving, stopped it getting in, bought time. And they did so at least cost. Now, some other countries decided that you could let it in and there would be herd immunity. Well, that was, I suppose, a logical based on experience with influenza and other viral pandemics, but they made a big mistake as well. Now, it's one thing to look backwards, but at the time, I think the prudent thing was to stop it moving. And as I say, to give time. And the time that ought to have been then spent by many countries that were able to do that because of geography and distance and warning, then to get on with vaccination. The interesting thing, it has to be said, and it deserves a lot of attention in when the history of this thing is written, is the countries that then stopped it getting in, almost all of them were extremely slow in mobilising about vaccinations. The countries that made the big disasters at the beginning, presumably because they were collapsing, they moved very fast on vaccinations. So we've, there was no easy answer, but I'd still rather be in a place that had least death and disruption, upset, and highly vaccinated, and then try to figure out, well, how do we go ahead with what we know and what the evidence and the science dictates.
Ned, does that answer
Cool.
your question?
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. All right, so we're going to move to audience questions now. I'd love to see some more women on stage, so please raise your hand if you'd like to ask. Men can too, but gender balance would be nice. I'm just going to ask questioners, please keep your questions succinct, optimally less than 30 seconds. I'm going to mute you at 45 seconds because nobody needs longer than that to ask a question. So
I'll try to keep my answers succinct.
That way, while respecting Bill's time. Kelly, if you want to take first crack at question, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we can go to John Ross. All right, John Ross, nice to have you back.
Thank you. She's probably trying to chase that dog in the picture, that beautiful dog.
John.
Oh, no worries. So, Professor, thank you very much for speaking with us as a public health scientist, currently in the throes of medical school applications. This was very valuable information, and I just had one question for you. What are some lessons from the 1918 influenza do you think that we should have figured out by this pandemic, if you have any opinion one way or the other about it? John Ross out.
I think we should always learn from history. And it was, if I can say, in the HIV days 40 years ago, when people said what was in history and they raised the influenza pandemic of 1919, I was astonished that it happened. It had been lost to history that such a thing had occurred. It was quite remarkable that this thing that killed tens of millions of people around the world and had immense impacts almost everywhere had somehow been blipped out between the First World War and the Roaring Twenties and the Depression. And I know myself, I became very interested in how they had responded to the influenza pandemic, because for a while with HIV and AIDS, I know the governments thought, my goodness, what happens if it is like influenza and not easily containable by behavioural responses, clean needles and safe sex and so on, until we got a treatment. We didn't get a treatment for about 10 or 12 years with AIDS, and we've never had a vaccine or a cure. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen in the HIV days, and what happened in the influenza pandemic was so different. And we just got on with dealing with the HIV thing. But of course, now influenza, it was more like COVID, that it was transmitted in aerosol. People had to wear masks. But one of the lessons from the influenza pandemics was were the cities in America and elsewhere that saw this coming and took what you'd call the classic public health responses, really mobilised, used masks, used distancing, really created a community, people-led response. They did a lot better than the cities that just said, in a way, what the previous American administration said, well, it's okay, it'll work its way out, there's no problem, and, let's just cope with it. So the one thing I learned from looking at all of these things is that the public health responses are the best because they work, and they work to prevent. Public health is about preventing, and you do everything you can to prevent a serious situation getting worse. If you wait too long in the hope that it'll all be okay, or it's not as serious as people say, well, you run a terrible risk of allowing the thing to get out of control. And it really did. In many countries in the world, the influenza pandemic got out of control. And I think it went through 3 waves. Each was more deadly than the next. And then the virus put itself out of business because at a point beyond which it's too deadly, it just collapses. That's the remarkable thing that happens to viruses. But whoever wants to find out where that limit or that result would be by just letting it run, seems to me to be a really silly thing to do.
Ned, before we go ahead, just a reminder, we're here with Adjunct Professor Bill Bowtell, public health expert in Australia. And anyone, I didn't mention this before, but it's in the title. We are recording this and it'll be on YouTube. So by speaking, you will consent to this recording. Please, Ned, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Russ. Appreciate it. Alex, nice to see you as well. Over to you.
Thank you. So, Doctor, I really appreciate, as I've been listening, your sensitivity to a balance between the kind of economic impacts and other impacts versus just the pure public health. So, I guess to frame the general question, which is how you think about the question, what is the right balance? So a couple of examples, like in your understanding, what is a quantifiable downside of these large-scale lockdowns? I'm talking about jobs, I'm talking about mental health, depression, suicide, distance from family, businesses shutting down, losing their businesses. And a corollary to that is then what would you consider to be unacceptable? And then the opposite of that is, what do you consider to be an acceptable number of deaths? Is it similar to influenza, more, less, and why influenza? So again, I really appreciate your time here. Thank you.
Well, they're very big questions. Right at the outset, I'm not a doctor, probably to the benefit of the health of the people of Australia, but I do my best in trying to figure out these public policy questions to listen to our best medical and epidemiological and virological experts. The question of economics is extremely important. I mean, we're social and economic animals, and of course, we have to have a thriving and functioning economy. And the question is how you do that. Now, very interestingly in Australia, I'll speak for Australia, we had COVID zero roughly between about October 2020 and the middle of June this year. The economy boomed when we didn't have COVID. This was against a lot of people's expectations. They thought things would be very bad. But in fact, funnily enough, behind a protectionist border, if you like, and with immigration having fallen right away, the economies of Australia and New Zealand did really well. And that was shown in the recently released figures for the second quarter of 2021, a very thriving, booming economy. And it shows that it wasn't a question of either the economy or public health. It stands to reason that if you don't have a serious out of control infectious disease, your economic outcomes are going to be better. They're going to work well. And the recession that people thought would happen in Australia was very small compared to the recession that clobbered the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe. So I think that's first principle is just protect public health, reduce the impacts of the disease, and the economy will do much better. Now we've got this living with COVID. The lockdowns in Australia, in Sydney and Melbourne, have been caused by the decision to let it run in an unvaccinated or largely unvaccinated country. We still have states in Australia, the very big ones, Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, where there is zero COVID. And right today, here in Sydney, I can't leave my apartment. I can't go to the theatre, I can't go to the football, I can't go to the cafe, but I can if I'm in Brisbane, if I were in Brisbane or in Perth. So where are there better economic freedoms today in Australia? Certainly not in Sydney or Melbourne. So here we are, we've got to deal with it. We've got to get ourselves vaccinated to get out of it. But I think it's a false dichotomy, truthfully, to say there's the economy and public health. It's all in it together. And this is going to be the outcome, obviously, in the United States, United Kingdom. Until we reconfigure our economies to deal with the new realities of Delta, we are going to have very sporadic, bad economic outcomes. Maybe not for the share market, and maybe not for the top end of town and the very rich people. But I can tell you, you're going to have very serious impacts on people who are in the gig economy, casual workers who lose their jobs, who in the end are going to take the full brunt of what is now ripping through our societies, and is going to continue to do so until we can get a real handle on reducing the amount of virus and act prudently and effectively to stop the thing getting worse. As to the question of deaths, who knows, right? I mean, all I know is the fewer deaths, the better. The fewer cases, the better. I don't believe that in a democracy we can consign anybody, poor, vulnerable, and decide that someone else's life is not worth as much as my father's life or my wife's life or my child's life, which is implicit in the idea that some people in charge of things consign some to a very hard response and impact of COVID Delta and what comes after, and other people who are vaccinated, who are better off, who are wealthier, will be fine. I think that's morally indefensible, frankly.
All right. Thanks for the question, Alex. All right. Next question comes from one of the people I admire most on this app, Dr. James Thompson. James, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bill, for being here tonight and taking our questions. Thanks for setting this up, Gabe. Professor Bill, John Campbell, who was mentioned earlier, of the UK, has, in addition to noting a change in disposition as it relates to reaching herd immunity, and that is that it's unlikely, has also gone on to say that because of this shift in intention, we should just utilize resources to test those who are sick or have symptoms and not spend so much of our resources testing everybody. Furthermore, assuming everybody will eventually get infected, the silver lining there being that those that are fully vaccinated will likely have milder disease and not fill hospital beds and die. That those people will survive and go on to be possibly super protected immunologically, as well as those who are passively infected that then get infected by a new variant such as Delta. So in effect, if it's not such a bad thing if the fully vaccinated get infected, which we are already seeing, do you agree with this twist of optimism? The answer to this could reflect on public policy and boosters as it relates to local and global vaccine equity. And I'm complete.
Well, I'm certainly not qualified or able to be in the business of predicting the future or weighting one eminent scientist's predictions of what could happen against anybody else's. All I know is that most of them got it dreadfully wrong a year and a half ago. So we've got to see what happens. I think the question of resources in testing, hospitals, treatments, all the rest of it, it's just a really trivial amount of investment compared to the benefits of getting it right. We now exist in a world where untold trillions of dollars are being created by the pressing of computer keys, by the reserve banks and so on. And a lot of money, trillions, is going into a lot of things that are not as good investments, in my view, as strengthening the public health resources and supporting all the people who need access to testing, treatment, all of the preventive measures that we know work so well against Delta and what is coming. So look, I'm not qualified really to make that opinion. All I can say is, as a general principle, we must build and strengthen the public health systems. And if we do that, we will get a big benefit in terms of health impacts and obviously on economic and social impacts. They will be less than, the adverse impacts will be less than they otherwise would have been. How it will play out, well, there's a lot of Nobel Prizes yet to be won by people who get it right. And we've got to have that debate. We've got to get it out there and try to translate it into the strongest possible policy outcomes. I wish that that were happening everywhere, but I don't see much evidence of it, I'm afraid to say, at least not in a coordinated and sensible way.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. James. All right, so we have 3 more questioners. I appreciate them just keeping it brief as the prior questioners have. Thanks to everybody for working with us. And Bill, if you wouldn't mind keeping your answers to maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, we can make sure we get you out of here at about halfway past the hour. So, Roger, your turn, man. Good to have you.
Yeah. So, Professor Bill, do you believe that in Australia the policies that you're advocating for, the idea of being more authoritarian, you mentioned that there is no libertarian approach that would work to this. Do you believe that the Australian people will be more apt to fall in line? Because, as you know, the U.S. has a different culture here. Do you feel that the people in Australia are ready to have their, the government have a boot on their throat when it comes to vaccines? That, as we know, you could, even when vaccinated, you could still spread the disease, catch the disease, die from the disease. Do you believe that that Australians would be of the mindset to trade their liberty for some small monicum of increased safety?
Or give me liberty or give me death. I mean, yes, I do. I think most Australians overwhelmingly believe in the science of vaccination. They know it's better for them, their families, the community, and overall they'll reduce the amount of virus in circulation that can translate into real harm. So in Australia, I think they're more than willing to do it and to act in a way that in the end gives them more freedom, more liberty, and more ability to get on with their lives than we see in many other countries, including, regrettably, in the United States. There's no freedom if you're dead. There's no freedom if you're on long-term ventilation and suffering long COVID. That's not freedom. That is the working out of very poor public policy. So I think most Australians, and I'm sure if it was put to a vote, would want COVID out of the country. And if it's got to be dealt with, it's got to be dealt with in a contained and manageable way. That's greatly to the social benefit, cultural, economic, political benefit of this country. I think that's, I think you'd find very few Australians who would willingly embrace what has been the outcome in most of the United States or in much of Europe or even the United Kingdom.
I want to give Roger a chance to respond and ask any follow-up question.
No, I appreciate that, Gabe. The perspective that I come from, Professor Bill, is one of maximizing human liberty. I don't buy into this idea of trading my freedom for safety. And I say this from a perspective of somebody that respects
science, I'm actually vaccinated. And I do encourage people to talk to their doctors, do their research, come up with their own decision. My pushback and my encouragement for everyone is to push back on measures of medical coercion, the forced mandates, employers threatening to fire people if they don't do this. By the way, here in the U.S., if you're not a Christian, I would adopt a religion real quick so you can claim a medical exemption, because these things are probably coming. But I guess the question for you, Professor Bill, is why is it that when we know that the death tolls are not all that high, to be quite honest, and we know that when we look at the paperwork of who's died of COVID, there's a difference between who's died of COVID and who's died with COVID. Of the two people that I know that have died that had COVID, one of them had stage 4 brain cancer, another was on kidney dialysis. So there's a huge difference, and there's a conflation in these statistics. So this disease isn't quite as deadly as some make it out to be. And my question is, why would we mandate this? It seems like if we were going to mandate things that are unsafe, maybe we should mandate strength and conditioning classes and balance classes to make sure that elderly people don't fall, because falling and injuring yourself here in the U.S. seems to be more deadly than COVID, but we're not considering those types of mandates. So I'm just wondering, why the draconian measure here?
We're at some kind of record because Roger's asked 2 questions and hasn't mentioned Fauci once, which is a record, I think.
Well,
Oh my goodness, don't tempt him.
I didn't want to insult his friend, his honorable, honest friend.
Roger really doesn't like Anthony Fauci, Bill.
Well, we disagree on that. Look, governments reflect the will of the people, and they do in Australia. We mandate seatbelts for cars, and that's remarkably reduced the toll of death and injury from car smashes. We tell people, the people tell the people, that you can't drink and drive, and if you do drink and drive and we catch you, you'll be charged, and if you keep drinking and driving and cause smashes, you go to jail. There's a whole range of things we do in the interest of public health that the people democratically agree to and approve, and have worked out extremely well. I don't see vaccinations being any different to that. That is the price you pay for living in society. You get all the benefits of so-called freedom, but you don't get the right to cherry pick. It's a deal. You pay your taxes, you have your vote, and if society decides properly and democratically that some things are going to be done in the interests of the commonwealth, the common good, then they're going to be done. And that's how it works. If you want to opt out of it, opt out of all the other things that you benefit from because of collective action. It's all very well and good. I mean, the American, I cannot for the life of me see that how some Americans have approached dealing with COVID or climate change or many of these other problems that now of an existential nature really would have much popular support or interest, frankly, in Australia or many other countries around the world.
All right, let's keep it moving here. And thanks, Roger. Appreciate it. Eric, nice to see you. Over to you.
Hi. Very fast 2-part question. What should we understand about draconian lockdowns? It seems to me just in an abstract sense, if you really seriously lock people down, and I think you folks do, and we don't really do it at that level for 4 to 6 weeks, you should be able to take the infection rates down very, very low. So what's reality? That's question A. Question B is, how important is it for wealthy nations to invest in vaccination around the world, in part to reduce the likelihood of mass death, but also to reduce the probability of horrible variants? Thank you very much, Erica Lazarus on Instagram.
Great question.
Much appreciated.
Great question.
Well, on your second question, the whole world has to be vaccinated. The amount of virus in the world has to be reduced because, as you rightly say, as long as if there is a vast amount of virus in the world, what we've seen in the last year and a half and presumably in the next year or two is that the greater the load of virus, the more opportunity there is for the virus to mutate and evolve. That's what the epidemiologists say, and I think we have to accept that. So we've got to bring that down. We've got to vaccinate the world. I mean, it's a huge task, but the amounts of money required to do it compared to almost anything else, compared to the benefits, are just a drop in the ocean. If we can do that, we will really reduce the likelihood of terribly adverse impacts. But everybody's got to be vaccinated. We're not out of this until they are. The first point on lockdowns.
That's like $25 billion between all the wealthy nations. You would strongly support it. Is that what I just heard you say?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
So let's say that's $25-30 billion. It's one estimate that I've heard split between all the wealthiest nations. That would seem like a very reasonable investment.
Yeah, I think 35-50 billion, yeah, something like that.
Drop in.
Of course, what that means in terms of business and so on and so forth, I don't know. Yeah.
What do we learn about the draconian lockdowns? I mean, are they effective? What are the limits? Thank you.
Well, draconian, the lockdowns were most effective when we didn't have effective treatments or vaccines. Now, of course, if you go to 80 or 90% vaccinated and people have got those protections, then clearly, at least as far as we can see, the lockdowns become less useful, obviously, because where can you go beyond 80% vaccinated against Delta? What are lockdowns going to achieve at that rate? However, the only problem is Delta's Delta, and we see these other things coming along on the horizon. Now, do the vaccines give protection against those variants? What will that mean? So the idea that we can take lockdowns, lockouts, or these other public health measures off the table for all time, just because we're vaccinated to 80% on Delta, wouldn't seem to be borne out by the history of the way in which this thing has rocketed around the world. But lockdowns, if they're useful, use them. If they're not, don't. Certainly the most important thing we can do really is be strengthened and protected by vaccination rates at very high levels, and then maintained depending on how the virus evolves and mutates, and how good our very excellent, actually, scientists and pharma companies and so on are at developing the next generation of vaccines that might have, according to the epidemiologists, so-called sterilizing immunity, so that if you get it, you can't pass it on. I mean, if that would be a great achievement, obviously, if we could get to that in the next 12 months or so.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks for the questions, Eric. All right, our final questioner is Cheryl. Cheryl, good to have you back up here. You have a brief question for Bill?
Thank you. Dr. James actually asked a question I have in my head very eloquently, and the good news is we already have good therapeutics in the process of getting trial in, I think, other parts of the world, including Japan. So the the COVID rate in US is about 12% of the population. Australia is about 0.2 to 0.4% of the population, and in Japan is about 1%. So I'm actually quite pragmatic with vaccine, but I don't really agree with the vaccine mandate or vaccine passport mandate, especially when the current vaccine, we all know that it's not effective in stopping the spread. So why are we pushing it and not, waiting to see whether there's an upgraded version of a vaccine coming up soon before we push for it? And since Israel has already volunteered to do the booster shot with the current vaccine, and why don't we wait to see their transfers before we mandate it to the rest of the countries who are kind of wanting to do it?
It's a very good point, and I think this shows that none of this is settled. As I said before, we're in the middle of a vast global scientific experiment to see how these vaccines work in practice among millions of people. What does it actually do to reduce the spread of the virus and to sustain that reduction? Let's hope that that's a reduction. So what we're seeing in many countries and many states in Australia is each political jurisdiction is trying to adjust to the realities in their own way. What I think is extremely important is not to look at just what we're doing here in New South Wales today or in British Columbia or Japan, but there's got to be a lot more free-flowing information about what's working well in countries that are trying a whole range of different responses to it. And that would include, in my view, vaccine passports, because that's a social question in the end. It's not a magic solution by having 2 ticks on your phone. I mean, what does it do to social interaction? What does it actually really do on the ground? What does it do, to be fair, in places like in America, from your previous question, where they ascribe a value to the liberty to do what they wish to do and to go where they wish to go? You know, how do these things all play out together? So we need not just the epidemiologists, the virologists, but we need the social scientists, the anthropologists, the journalists, the religious people. You know, everybody's got a stake in this, and nobody's got the right answer. And of course, I believe in science and evidence, but I also believe in just the common sense and integrity of the people, and all the people to understand what is the impact of this. And out of all of the things we could do, how's it gone in Israel? How's it gone in Florida? How's it gone in Tasmania? And this interaction is just vital. And I think it's very interesting in the last year and a half with Zoom and all of these things. There's a huge conversation going on in the world at this level, completely separately to what's going on vertically to our political leaderships. And there is no really right way to do it. But I think it's this discussion, this democratic and fair discussion, that's somehow got to be translated into much better policy outcomes at the top level. In fact, you know, it's all we pay them in the end. We don't work for them, they work for us. So a lot of people have got to just pound the table a bit and just say, well, that's all very interesting, but we'd like something that works for all the people, thanks, and that protects all the people and protects all of them as well as the very rich and well off. You know, we've got to start making those points very strongly and leave nobody behind, even the people who have a conscientious objection to vaccination. They, amongst all, can't be left behind or left out.
Thanks, Bill. Ned, before I ask a quick couple of questions to finish this off, because I know we're really stretching Bill's time. Ned, did you have a final thought? Or
Gabe, you've done an incredible job curating guests, Bill being the latest, but Professor Doherty, now Bill, really nice work. You run some of the most informative COVID rooms, and Bill, really grateful to have you here. You've been incredibly informative, and I'm sure I speak for most, if not all, the people in the audience when I say you're a really effective communicator, and we're really glad to have had a chance to hear you tonight. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, if I may give credit, was so modest that when I asked him to originally join us like a month or more ago, he suggested Professor Mike Toole, who we had a few weeks ago as well. So
good.
That was you, Bill. Last questions. I know. Thank you for subjecting yourself to this and giving us your time. On a practical level, if the restrictions open up, it's a selfish question, but I think people will be interested around the world. We're now in a similar situation to many places around the world here in Sydney, unfortunately. If restrictions open up, how do you protect yourself? How do you suggest I protect myself? My family, for instance, is all double vaccinated, but my brother's 3 kids are 5 and under, and they're not. So, do you have any advice in this context? Do I have to wait until they're all vaccinated? I know you're not a doctor, but how do you see this on a practical level?
Look, your obligation is to protect your family and yourself. We do have to inform ourselves. We do. it's all very well to be sceptical, but we do have to listen to, in the end, the people who've got a very clear handle on how this thing might affect you. And then, of course, we all want to travel. We all want to get back to something approaching normality and to join our people. We knowing that there are going to be some risks. So we've got to handle those things. I think it is very important, though, that we understand what we are going to do in relation to kids, to unvaccinated kids. It's not enough just to say that they get the protections if everybody else is vaccinated. They are a very special category of people we've got to look after extremely well. But we're just going to have to deal with it as best we can. We know, thankfully, this virus has no brains. We are better than the virus. I fear for the future of humanity if the virus had anything like the brains of a tadpole. I think we'd be done and dusted. But it doesn't. We know that we can control its impacts by behavioural means. We know that vaccinations are very good. We know that masks are very good in areas. So all of those things together really seem to work very well, even against Delta. Even New Zealand is doing very well at suppressing the Delta outbreak there this weekend by behavioural means. So we've got all the tools really that we need to use, but we've got to use them all creatively and adjust to the realities as Delta and COVID moves on. We've got to move on with it and hopefully move ahead of it. And if we do that, we'll hopefully all come out at the other end wiser than we are today.
We plugged your book earlier, Bill. You're a cultured man. What book would you recommend for my book club? That's my final question to you. If it's not your book, can't be one of your books.
Yeah, well, my book's a very fast read. I didn't read it to be a long story. I tell you what is a very short read, but goes to this question of hubris, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein's monster. It goes right to the heart of how wrong things can go with well-meaning people trying things that they oughtn't to do, and what can go wrong and right with science. So it's a very humanistic book, but it's got a cautionary tale there for us, I think.
I put you on the spot, and that was great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You've been amazing and humble, and I think everyone's benefited from having you here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Gabe. A pleasure. Thank you very much.